Thank you, everyone, for coming. As part of our series, Thinking Strategically, my thanks are to Kathy Collins for making this work possible, and of course to all of you for attending. We are, as you know, very mindful of people's time. This is a Friday before a bank holiday, and our seminars always end rigorously at 13:15. The event is recorded, so if you don't want to appear, do just ask questions in the chat. But of course, this is an informal event and we are talking among friends. So to begin formally, one area that as a subject community, we know that we need to develop is the actual and potential policy implications of our research. And to take forward the excellent work that Wendy Ayres-Bennett and the MEET research project has pioneered to such an extraordinary degree. The door to working with policymakers is, in fact, wide open, but we need to know how to do this kind of work. And so it's my great pleasure to introduce Olivia Glaze, who has been working precisely on this area. Olivia is a medical humanities and gender studies scholar, specializing in contemporary Portuguese literature, film, and photography. She was awarded her DPhil from Oxford in 2022 and is currently the MHRA Languages and Policy postdoctoral researcher. She's based here at ILCS. She's working alongside Wendy and Charles Forsdick to develop deeper collaborations between academics and policymakers in order to strengthen the use of languages in evidence-informed policy. In addition, Olivia is an AHRC postdoc at the University of Exeter, where she works with Catherine Murphy on the project Reading Bodies, Narrating Illness in Spanish and European Literatures and Cultures. She has published a series of articles in leading journals, and her monograph, Women Writers, Trauma, Autofiction, and the End of the Portuguese Empire, Self-Camouflage as Survival, is forthcoming with the Palgrave Life Writing series. So, Olivia, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Charles. I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully everybody can see that. Charles, if you can just give me a thumbs up if you can see the slides, that would be helpful. Right, perfect. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. I'm so grateful for everyone taking the time on what is a very sunny, as Charles mentioned, Friday pre-bank holiday to join us on this for this session on developing policy dimensions of research. And I think the strong turnout really highlights just how much interest and appetite there is in connecting our work in languages and cultures with the world of policy. So I'm hoping by the end of this seminar, you'll have a clearer sense of how you might approach policy engagement in your own research. In terms of agenda, I'm splitting this up into sort of 5 or 6 main points. So I'll be explaining what policy engagement actually is, what do we mean by that, hopefully busting a few myths. I'll share a few case studies that illustrate best practice. And then the main bulk of it, I'm going to be introducing my policy roadmap, which is a practical guide to help you think through the policy relevance of your work, identify the audience, and then consider how you might best reach that audience. When I talk a little bit about translating your research for that audience, I'm going to mention the policy project that Charles briefly introduced that I'm currently working on with Wendy Ayres-Bennett and Charles Forsdick, which is generously funded by the MHRA, and explain how you can get involved because we're looking for a little bit of participation. And then finally, I'll share a few key takeaways before we open the floor for discussion. So I'll be speaking for about 40 minutes, which should leave us plenty of time for questions and conversation at the end. So let's get started. What do we mean by policy, first and foremost? I think when we hear the word policy, I've certainly been guilty of this. Many of us immediately think formal government documents, official legislation, dense reports. And whilst those certainly are examples of policy, the term encompasses a really wide range of practices and decisions that shape our everyday life. And when thinking about languages in particular, there are a few areas of policy that might be a good fit, that might be relevant for us. This isn't an exhaustive list, but just a few ideas. Education policy is a great example. So where this includes decisions around what subjects are taught in schools, which languages are included or excluded, how those languages are taught, how they're assessed. If your research focuses on bilingualism, minority languages, language acquisition, that might be a great element for you to look at in terms of education policy. If you are a researcher in memory or heritage studies, perhaps cultural policy might be a good fit for you, thinking about the decisions of arts organisations, museums, public funding bodies, about what culture is preserved, whose stories are told, how they're represented. Maybe health policy, if you, like me, work in the medical humanities, that could be a good fit. So health policy covers strategies that shape how healthcare is delivered, maybe thinking about access to interpretation or translation services, making sure we have culturally appropriate care, addressing language barriers that contribute to health inequalities. So language research in the medical humanities can be a really great fit there. Many of us study diaspora, borders, post-colonial identity. That's a great fit for international policy, where international policy thinks about the strategies, the agreements that sort of govern cross-border relationships. Minority languages also fit into international policy, the role of language in diplomacy, experiences of migration. The list is really endless. So, of course, there are more policy areas than these four, but they're just a brief example of how we might just start to think about the way that languages, research and culture, how it might interact with policy work. And it isn't just government who is involved in policy. We also have different policy stakeholders, charities and NGOs, advocacy groups, think tanks, foundations, professional associations. UCFL is a relevant one in our case. I also could add into this list academic institutions. Many of our universities now have policy research centres or policy teams that have links and networks with all or some of these different policy stakeholders. So it isn't just government. Lots of these stakeholders are deeply involved in shaping policies related to social issues, the environment, health, education, human rights. And I think we can probably all agree that the researchers, as we are, of languages and culture, can play a really vital, useful role in those kind of areas. We can draw on our expertise in identity or community, history, politics, to name just a few. And often our work intersects with the very concepts that policies aim to shape in that space. So a possibly sort of controversial question: why does policy engagement matter? Why should we as researchers in languages and cultures care about policy? We know as researchers we're all balancing really demanding workloads, expectations around academic output seem to rise daily. So why do we need to add another pillar into our research? Well, put very, very simply, policy shapes the world we live in and therefore the world that our research responds to. As I've sort of mentioned briefly, policy affects the languages taught in schools, what gets funding in the arts, how migration's framed, how histories are remembered in public spaces. And languages has a really unique ability to help address those issues and influence how policy is made or changed. Personally, I think one of the strengths of languages research and research in culture is how it centers people and the human experience. And I think in policy, that's absolutely key and sometimes can be forgotten, and we can help change that relationship. But engaging with policy isn't about turning everyone into a policy advisor. That's not what I'm going to be suggesting today. It's about recognizing that the research we do has real world implication and that we have a role, some might argue a responsibility, to think about those implications. Similarly, we know, I'm sure, society often underestimates the relevance and impact of languages research. And so by engaging with policy, we can change that narrative. We can demonstrate its practical value and its essential role in addressing complex societal challenges. So when I say policy engagement, what do I actually mean by that? I think it's really easy to think about big dramatic moments. A piece of your research or a stat in your research directly leads to new legislation, or we think about an academic giving evidence to Parliament that sparks major change. And that can often make policy engagement feel really daunting. But in reality, Policy engagement is much broader than that, and it can also be much smaller than that. It covers a wide range of activities. It certainly doesn't require your work to fundamentally reshape a law in order to be meaningful or impactful. Policy engagement, really at its core, I think, is about building connection between research and the people and organizations that make and influence decisions. And as I've mentioned, those decisions happen at many levels, not just in high government, local councils, NGOs, charities, think tanks. And often those stakeholders act as key intermediaries, translating research for policymakers or amplifying it through their networks. And so by engaging with those groups, you can help make sure that your work is accessible and relevant to those who need it. And for many of us, the most effective and rewarding policy engagement actually takes place in some of those smaller, more informal settings. I've got a few examples here on the slides of some different forms of policy engagement. It might be a conversation with someone working in an NGO. You're sharing insights from your research that could inform the way they design their programs or the way they advocate for a particular cause. Or maybe you're invited to a roundtable discussion with local government. You're helping them better understand a particular issue. Or perhaps you contribute to a short blog post or a creative toolkit. Maybe it's then picked up by practitioners or advocacy groups. It goes on to inform their training or the ways that they work. So all of these interactions, no matter how modest they might seem, are forms of policy engagement. They help us shape how issues are understood, how problems are framed, how decisions are made at different levels of society. And sometimes these engagements, these kind of smaller engagements, can lead to bigger changes over time. But even if they don't, they're still important, they still matter, and they ensure that the evidence and insights from your research can be put to good use. It's also a great way to build relationships and open doors for future collaboration. So the key point here is you don't have to set your sights on something huge, on changing the law, influencing government at the highest level. If you can, of course, do it. But policy engagement can be incremental, it can be flexible, and every conversation or shared resource has the potential to make a difference in some way. The important thing is about connecting your research to the real world. Now, often we as language researchers can find it a bit difficult to pinpoint where our work might engage with policy, especially if your work is entirely qualitative. So as I've sort of mentioned earlier, there are some fields where policy engagement is a bit more obvious, a bit more straightforward than others. If you're a researcher in languages acquisition, okay, education policy makes sense. If I'm a post-colonial scholar, migration policy maybe makes sense. But in other areas, it's a bit less straightforward. So speaking for myself, as someone who's in Portuguese literature and film, that maybe feels a little more confusing as to how we might link it to policy. But I think with some creativity, with some blue sky thinking, most research can find a policy angle. And I want to share two case studies that I think help illustrate this point. So the first is Hungry for Words. This is a project led by Professor Heike Bartel. Some of you may know her. She's a professor of German at the University of Nottingham. And Professor Bartel is an expert in illness, health, and recovery narratives in German and English. And there's a particular focus that she has on masculinity and eating disorders. And so she developed this big Hungry for Words project, which aimed to transform how male eating disorders were understood in healthcare and education. And one of the main outputs was this animated clinical training video, which was designed for GPs and practice nurses, and it communicates the lived experiences of men seeking help for eating disorders for the first time. And that animation was based on input from lived experience, as well as key themes identified in literary research, which involved a range of personal narratives, fictional and autobiographical writing. So you see there where the literary studies work comes in, online blogs and forums, and also some client accounts. And the animation had a series of really amazing real life impacts. It was accredited by the Royal College of GPs, recommended to their 50,000 plus members. It was also adopted by UK charities, Mental Health First Aid England, BEAT and First Steps ED, for their staff and professional training. It was also adopted by University of Nottingham for their 2 nursing courses. And so that counts as policy engagement. You can see how Heike's expertise in German narratives of illness and eating disorders underpins that project, how it's been creatively applied to help shape the foundations of that work. The second case study, some of you might be familiar with this, is the MFL mentoring scheme. It's a project led by Professor Claire Guerrara, Professor of French, and Lucy Jenkins at Cardiff University. And this initiative was developed in response to the decline in the number of students that were choosing languages at GCSE in Wales. And so the project brought together all 9 Welsh universities in partnership with local secondary schools. And essentially undergrads and postgrads were trained to go into schools and deliver a 6-session mentoring program to students before, critically, they were about to make their GCSE subject decisions. And so the mentors would act as motivators, as role models. They talk about the value of languages. It was that peer-to-peer mentoring model. And there was huge success. They had over 30,000 pupils participating in 178 schools across Wales in the first 10 years of the project. And Professor Guerrara's research on e-mentoring and the benefits of that has influenced the Department for Education's language initiatives. It's also been involved in some pilot projects in Spain and New Zealand. So again, a really strong example of policy engagement in action. But what I really like about this case study is it shows how researchers can get involved in policy-focused projects that go beyond their key research areas. So for example, Professor Guerrara, her research is in French literature, mainly narratives of the Second World War, but she's developed this significant strand of her work within the mentoring space, within supporting language learning in schools. So it shows, I think, you don't have to feel limited to your original niche. You can branch out, develop something entirely new in response to real world challenges. And that, I think, is quite an exciting opportunity. Don't feel as though you have to shoehorn policy in if it doesn't feel like a natural fit. You can do something entirely different. But at the heart of both of these examples is public engagement. And for me, engaging with the public isn't just a step in the process. It's often the driving force behind meaningful policy work, especially if your research doesn't include traditional data or stats, or it's not necessarily clear where policy might fit. I think if you find it challenging to see where policy engagement could connect to your research, it can be helpful to think first about impact activities. They often require us to think about our research more broadly, and that can be a really helpful way to identify paths for policy engagement. So we now arrive at our policy roadmap. Where do we start? What do we do? I've hopefully convinced you that policy engagement is important and maybe not as daunting as you previously thought, but how do we start? Where do I go? Who do I speak to? Let's break it all down. So step 1 on the policy roadmap is locate. Locate the policy relevance of your research. So engaging with policy doesn't mean shifting your research entirely towards politics. Instead, it's about finding points of connection between your expertise and the priorities and challenges that policymakers are grappling with. So we have to step back and ask ourselves that horrible question: why does my work matter beyond the academy, beyond academia? Think about who could benefit from your findings. Think about the big macro themes. As I said, you can use public engagement to loosen that up if you're finding it difficult. Don't get too locked into the nuance. What are the core themes or societal issues that your work touches on? Maybe it's social cohesion, maybe it's health and well-being, maybe it's community representation. The importance of creative practice, that's always a good one for those of us involved in literature or theatre or film. How can those themes be harnessed to address real-world challenges and bring new perspectives into public debate? So speaking for myself, as someone, as I've said, in Portuguese literature, I'm not going to go to government and suggest that my work on Portuguese poet Fernando Pessoa is going to change society. But what I am going to do is I'm going to think, okay, my work deals in the medical humanities, illness, disability, gender. How can my knowledge on those topics be of benefit? How can I take what I've done in public engagement and make it useful to address some of those questions? So moving on to our second stage of the roadmap, identify your policy audience. So we worked out the relevance. Who now are the decision makers or the influencers that need to hear that? And maybe who do they pay attention to? Do they pay attention to think tanks, to NGOs? Would it be useful to speak to them? So your audience might be government. It might not. It might be some of the other policy stakeholders that I mentioned in the earlier slides. And so the goal here is to ensure that your work just doesn't sit in academic journals. It's actively informing public conversations or institutional thinking. And again, if that feels tricky, if either of the two first points on the roadmap feel tricky, collaborate. Collaborate across disciplines. Don't be afraid to reach out beyond your own field. Policy engagement often happens really well in interdisciplinary spaces. There might be colleagues who already have established networks. Your input can deepen what they're doing. So don't feel as though you have to do all of this alone. You absolutely don't. Okay, point 3 on the roadmap. We've worked out the relevance, worked out the audience. Now, where do I go? I need to find these people and find the right contact channels. So if your audience is outside of government, the other policy stakeholders that I mentioned, this is a bit more straightforward. It's really nothing more glamorous than cold calling and cold emailing. And building those relationships, it takes time. So please proceed patiently. It's actually useful, I think, to build those relationships regardless of whether you have current research to share. It can be helpful to build relationships with those stakeholders so they can help you understand what kind of knowledge is needed and how your expertise might be most effectively applied. You can also, if your university has public engagement or policy engagement teams, get in touch with them. They also might have established networks already in place. So government, if the audience is government, reaching out to government is a little more complicated for obvious reasons. Cold calling a department, it can get you a response if you're lucky, but there are some other more established channels. So the first, UK Parliament Knowledge Exchange Unit. You're going to hear a lot of acronyms in the next few slides as we talk more about government. So this is the main contact point for researchers who want to engage with UK Parliament. They offer online training, a weekly roundup email, some guides and resources. You can get in touch with them, have a look at what they're doing through the website. The second sort of main, more general point of contact is our parliamentary thematic research leads. So from 2024 to 2026, there are 8 thematic research leads in Parliament, including one dedicated to arts and humanities. That is Dr. Helen McCabe from the University of Nottingham. And they're essentially mid-career researchers who spend a part of time embedded in Parliament, whilst also continuing their university roles. Their job is, in principle, to strengthen the use of research and expertise in the House of Lords and House of Commons by encouraging collaboration and knowledge sharing. So these two, the Knowledge Exchange Unit and the research leads, are good first points of contact. If you don't know where to go, the Parliament website is your best friend. In these two instances, you can find out all the information from there. The next point of contact is to respond to a call for evidence. So governments and councils regularly open calls for evidence. They want feedback or input on a wide range of topics. The biggest example of this are the ARIs, the areas of research interest. They're specific topics or issues that government is interested in. They're really wide-ranging, allow civil servants to ensure that research efforts are targeted where evidence is most needed. So as the database, you can see the link there on the slide. Researchers essentially need to familiarize themselves with that database, has a search function, and that is the primary route through which government communicates their research priorities. It's not a perfect system. There are a few challenges. If you typed in languages, for example, you might get one hit. Languages are rarely explicitly mentioned, so you need to go back to that kind of more macro thinking you've done in the first stage of the roadmap and search for some of those higher level concepts. Next are the select committees. These are cross-party groups made up of MPs, Lords, sometimes both, set up to investigate important topics and hold inquiries, and they regularly seek evidence from subject experts. They might call individuals to come and give oral evidence as well. So again, you will notice a running theme on the Parliament website, there is a list of all the select committees. Each one has its own page where they post these calls for evidence. And then you have the details as to deadlines and how you submit that evidence. Next, similar but slightly different, the APPGs, the all-party parliamentary groups. They're informal cross-party groups focused on specific topics or issues. And they sometimes run their own inquiries and so call for evidence. But this is not publicly listed on the Parliament website in the same way the select committees do. So you have to kind of keep an eye on their social media channels. Some of them have their own websites. You can find the full list of APPGs on the Parliament website. So take a look, see ones that might relate to your research. Of particular relevance to us is the APPG in modern languages. You can also reach out to the individual secretariats or admin assistants to ask them about what their upcoming work might be. So the running theme with these three is researchers essentially have to keep an eye across the websites. So the Parliament website is your first stop shop to then branch out for additional information on these three call for evidence spots. The next way for government is to contribute to a briefing. So a briefing's a short document, 1 or 2 pages, prepared for government officials to quickly bring them up to speed on a particular issue. And so these are created by the Commons and Lords libraries. There's a research team in both of those libraries, and they regularly use academic research to create briefings, debate packs, summaries for parliamentarians. So if your research is relevant, there's a great chance you could get it cited or referenced in any of those materials. They have all their briefings published on their website, and they're updated sporadically. So you can search through, find the ones where you could add your research, get in touch with them, or you can suggest something totally new to them as well. You just mark it for the attention of the subject specialist. Again, running theme, go to the Parliament website. All the details are there. Next one is POST, Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology. In a similar way, POST produces these short accessible briefing documents called post notes on a really wide range of policy topics, and they actively consult with researchers and review recent academic work when they're pulling them together. So you can check POST's current work programme, see what topics are coming up. You can sign up for alerts. You can email them to suggest topics for future post notes if you think something's missing. So engaging with the libraries and POST, it's a great direct way to make sure that your research feeds into parliamentary debates and evidence-based decision-making. Now, of course, in the UK context, you've also got lots of opportunities to engage with parliaments across the devolved nations. So they're sort of similar in terms of on their websites, they have information as to who is currently looking for evidence, which committees are currently accepting evidence, and all three have their own in-house research services. So SPICE for Scottish Parliament, Senedd Research for Wales, and then also we have the Irish RAISE service too. So you can get in touch with them if you don't know where to go. They can help direct you. So lots of opportunities within the UK context to get involved across the devolved nations too. So we come back to the roadmap, final 2 stops on the journey. We now need to think about translating our research for a policy audience. It's not just what we know, it's about how we share it. And translating our research means taking that really detailed work that we've done and reshaping it to be able to speak to a broader audience. And this is one of the really big barriers between academics and policymakers, language and communication styles. We know as researchers that our academic writing can be quite jargon-filled. It can be quite dense. That can be great for scholarly debate, but it's not always accessible to non-specialists. And policy professionals, they need concise, short, snappy, direct, and actionable research. So that gap in communication or communication styles means that even if our research is highly relevant, it may not always be easily understood or even noticed by those in the policy world. So if we want to change that, I've got a few suggestions as to how we could present our work in a more simplified and accessible way. The first is writing a short, plain language briefing or summary doc that outlines your key findings. The second is publishing a piece on a public-facing blog, social media platforms. These are really great ways to help policymakers out. They're also searching for research. So if we can put that out in the world on socials, it can be really, really useful. Next, turning your research into an infographic, so really leaning on visuals is always really helpful. And last but not least, participating in public events, panels, exhibitions, roundtables, where you're speaking directly to non-academic audiences. So the point here is not to oversimplify your work. It's about making it more approachable, more visible, ultimately more impactful. As I say, policymakers are looking for our work. They're looking for evidence to help them. So if we can make our work easier to find and understand, all the better. So this is the perfect segue into my current project that Charles mentioned at the start with Wendy Bennett and Charles Forstick, funded by the MHRA. We're currently developing a big database of concise, accessible summaries of languages research, which is specifically tailored for policymakers. And so as part of the project, we're developing that database, but I'm also writing templates, making a collection of sample summaries and clear guidelines to help academics create their own research summaries that they can then upload to the database. So we're hoping that policymakers can use it as a knowledge broker, enabling them to connect with academics, to better understand our work, to really prove the relevance of languages research in addressing societal challenges. So if you're looking for an easy way to get your research in front of policymakers, this is going to be a great option for you. A really big part of the project and the initial process was consulting with civil servants, policy stakeholders, to understand what information they find most valuable. And the main big takeaway from that was the importance of demonstrating real life impact. So the summaries are designed to emphasize that aspect. They're short. The guidelines call for really easily understandable language. They're about 200 words in length, with different sections for the research challenge, outcome, methodology, and the big section is the real life impact section. But I also really hope that the database will be useful for academics, allowing us to see what work is being done in the field, how other colleagues are engaging with policy and achieving impact. So if you're unsure about where to start with any of this, I really hope that the database, when it goes live, will serve as a really valuable source of inspiration. And we're now at the stage where we need feedback from academics on our progress so far. I'd really like academics to test drive some of these summary templates and the guidelines. So to that end, I'm using this opportunity to shamelessly plug 2 workshops that I'm hosting on the 19th and the 20th of May to gather input from academics. I would love as many people as possible to attend across different fields, different languages, different career stages. You don't need any experience with policy. They're about 90 minutes online, and you'll get the opportunity to try your hand at writing one of these summaries, and I can then gather your insights and make any improvements before we launch. So if you're interested in participating, please just send me an email. I can share the details with you. If you can't attend a workshop, but you still want to contribute a summary later down the line, when we go live, please also get in touch. I can add you to our list of contributors. And we're aiming to gather as many summaries as possible, as I said, to showcase the breadth and value of languages research. So support from academics is really vital to the success of the project. So we'd really value your input and engagement either now or later down the line. And as I said, once the database is up and running, this will be a really simple way for academics to raise the visibility of their research and a helpful way to practice translating your work for a policy audience. So we've finally reached the final stage of our roadmap. So I've spoken about how you could get your current or your past work in front of policy stakeholders. But what about your future research? What can we do to build policy engagement into the way that we're planning and framing research from the start? It's often easier to do that than to add it in at the end. And so I think this means thinking beyond traditional academic outputs to consider how your work might intersect with a real-world challenge or contribute to solving a problem identified by policymakers. So when you're designing your next project, your next funding bid, you might think about shaping your research questions around issues currently on the policy agenda, or if that feels too aggressive in terms of the change, in terms of embedding of policy, you might think about designing outputs that are inherently action orientated or impact orientated. It might be a toolkit to help practitioners apply your findings. It might be your classic policy brief, maybe a creative or participatory project. I think this is great for us in languages, maybe a theatre performance, short film, installation that provokes dialogue on a key issue. It's intentionally designed for a non-academic audience. Or a policy engagement event. Bring together researchers, policymakers, and community members. So when we embed policy or a policy dimension into our research methodologies, our research becomes not just about knowledge production, but about impact and change. And thinking strategically in the name of this seminar series, we're all thinking about funding, we're all thinking about the current landscape of competition, how to differentiate our bids. And major funders like UKRI, AHRC, ESRC, and others, they regularly align their funding calls with government strategy. And funding bodies increasingly want to see that research has real-world impact, not just academic significance. So by designing future research with policy in mind, you make your proposals more competitive. So you might just want to take some time to have a look at current policy priorities, see where your research naturally connects. Don't feel as though you need to shoehorn it in. And a few particular funding opportunities there. We've got the UKRI Policy Fellowship, we've got the British Academy Innovation Fellowship, the policy-led route. Okay, so we've made it to the end of our policy roadmap. Now, if you are someone who believes in a nice mnemonic device, you might like to remember the main calls to action through the acronym LIFTED. I'll leave it up to you to decipher any secret messages in that about lifting up the impact of your research. So coming towards the end of my sort of section, I know I've thrown a lot of information, a lot of acronyms, a lot of government information. So what are some actionable steps that we can do today that don't feel too crazy, that feel reasonable, to help us embed policy into our research habits? So as I've said, if you're currently applying for research funding or thinking about it, just think about including a section on the policy relevance of your work. It doesn't have to be lengthy, just a little paragraph highlighting how your work could support practitioners, inform debates, inform policy. It can really make your application stand out. Second, when you publish your research, consider just taking an extra step to write a short, plain language summary. Think of that as the translation of your work for a non-academic audience. And we want to do that when we complete a project. Maybe you want to do it when you complete an article. And that summary can be shared with professional associations on social media as part of your university communications, or, in my opinion, the best location, Wendy, Charles, and my future database. And finally, when attending conferences and academic events, just keep an eye out for sessions that are linked with research and policy or practice. If they don't exist, maybe start one. Look for opportunities to invite policymakers, practitioners, community partners to join the conversation. And I really want to stress that this isn't a ticking the box exercise. It's not, okay, funding bodies want policy, so how am I going to try to squash this in? It's more about shifting how we think about our work, its potential to shape the world beyond academia. If we start to build in these habits into our regular research practice, over time, we can create a more open, connected research culture. So 3 quick points to close, and then I promise I'll stop talking. Policy is not something far removed. It's not something for someone else. It shapes the context of the world in which we work. We can help shape it in return. It is for languages researchers. It's not just for scientists, social scientists, people who work in qual research. It is absolutely for us. Get creative, even if it's not obvious at first. Where your research might fit, there's always a connection with languages research, the systems, structures, experiences that govern or are involved in our society and our lives. As I've said before, collaborate, think big, blue sky thinking. break off the shackles with some of the nuances and niches of our research and think big. And finally, engaging with policy doesn't mean squeezing your research into politics. It means expanding its reach. You don't need to overhaul your entire research agenda. You just need to start thinking differently about where your work can land so that our insights, the insights that our research in languages and cultures has, doesn't stay trapped in academic silos. Okay, so I've got a few additional resources here for anybody who wants to read a little bit more. The first, Building Collaborations Between Academics and Policymakers. This is a fantastic report that Wendy Ayres-Bennett did last year. It's essential reading for anyone who is interested in getting involved in policy. It gives a lot more detail on some of the contact channels that I've mentioned, but it also gives a really fantastic overview of some of the obstacles that we currently face between creating collaborations with policymakers. So really useful to just understand those issues, try to avoid the potholes. Would highly recommend that report. The second is a shameless plug, an interview that Wendy, Charles and I did about our project. So if you're interested in hearing more about that, please take a read. The second is a useful document by the Institute for Government, just a guide for academics. And the last is the Impact Toolkit from the ESRC. So hopefully those are just some additional documents people might find useful. So I would love to see everyone at my upcoming workshops. Please get in touch with me if you've got any questions or if you'd like to come along. But thank you so much. I'm going to stop there and I would love to hear everyone's questions and thoughts.
Thank you so much for that, Olivia. That was a model of clarity. What you had to say was very powerful. It was also very useful, user-friendly, and it also emphasizes how this is not something that one just acquires. It is a process and a process that continues. So I think there are plenty of things that we can ask you about, and I love the way that it is a continuing contribution to how we think about ourselves, our subject community, and our wider societal impact. While people are formulating questions, one of the things that struck me in particular was the way in which it isn't, what we do need all of us to do is not to think that we need to change our identity, what we do, but how we need to think that writing books and articles, though it is the bedrock of our academic identity as researchers, it is not enough. And that one does, and the first thing that we need to do is to be thinking about diversifying the formats in which we disseminate our research. And writing simply in different formats is something that we should all do. If you talk to a historian, as we all do, historians are aware of history of policy. The journal, it's been in existence for years. It does get to Whitehall. No one would think that there was anything strange. Indeed, it would be axiomatic also to think about writing for history and policy, as we can write for languages, society and policy, and as we can write for the conversation, or indeed the Times Higher. Once one's made that transition to writing in simple formats and developing a different mode of communication, then one is already on well advanced in the route towards policy. Is that a fair comment?
Yeah, absolutely. I really want to stress that it's not about trying to force your research into spaces where you don't feel it fits, forcing it into politics, forcing it into specific areas of policy. It's really just about trying to create connections with people outside of the academy, trying to share your research, trying to understand what those different stakeholders need. And as Charles has said, whether it's writing for the conversation or Times Higher, there are so many easy ways that we can just dip our toe into that water and slowly develop the skill set. That's what it is. It's developing a skill set and a toolkit for all of us in policy. So taking small incremental steps, I think, is really important. So no, I think that's totally fair, Charles.
Thank you. Manon.
Hi, thank you so much, Olivia. I'm also working in the medical humanities and focus on the 19th century, so I sometimes find it difficult to apply insights from an earlier period to today. So I wondered if you could say a bit more about the project you're working on at the moment, the Narrating Illness project, and how you've engaged with policy within that research.
Yeah, absolutely. I will sing the praises of Catherine Murphy, who's the PI on that project at Exeter, and we did a huge amount of public engagement work off the back of the core research bones, if you like, of that project. So the core pillars are thinking about the different ways that illness in the body is represented across European languages. I'm doing Portuguese. We have people in French, German, Italian. Catherine is the lead on Spanish. And in particular, her work is on neurasthenia. And she's, that's a historical term that we don't hear today. She's been thinking about how it links to contemporary burnout. And so the public engagement events that we created were linked to that concept. So we thought more broadly, we did a creative writing workshop on burnout and resilience for the public. We then had an open call for contributions of creative writing and art on the theme of burnout as a kind of stepping stone from that creative writing workshop that we then collated and published. Now, our next step in jumping from public engagement to policy engagement is we are taking the themes from that burnout anthology, the way that people use language to talk about that experience, the way people have spoken about different strategies that were helpful, and we're turning it into an illustrated booklet for GPs and health practitioners. So it's a direct link from public engagement to policy engagement that actually has been quite easy to do at present. The public engagement was a lot of work, but this little jump now to policy engagement has actually been, not to speak for Catherine, but I think it's been easier than we both thought it would be. So I don't know if that answers your question. We took a quite niche historical avenue of research on neurasthenia in Spanish. We came way out, took a big step back, thinking about the macro themes of burnout, resilience, creative writing, pulled that into a public engagement event, and then have used those learnings to now engage with Department for Health and Social Care to plug a gap on how people use language to talk about that experience. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I see that the steps involved. And in the public engagement sessions, just have one more brief question. Did you draw on literary texts, your actual primary materials in those sessions? Right, okay, thanks.
Yep, correct. So we, at the beginning, we're doing a similar thing for, we've put in an application for the Being Human Festival, actually, but we hope is accepted. But yes, at the beginning, we had different examples of Spanish literature. We had some visuals from that time that we used as the jumping off point.
Thank you. Charlotte.
Hi. Thank you, Liv. That was really amazing. As Charles said, so clear and really, really interesting. And my question is, have you looked at sort of institutional politics around this? So with the work that I've been doing at Oxford, looking at how we can increase our policy engagement in languages, it's raised some questions around the sort of reward and recognition, I think is the phrase I'm looking for, processes, and the extent to which policy engagement is recognised within those, and then the barriers, if it's not, then the barriers that puts up, because academics are incredibly busy trying to do several different jobs at once at all times, and adding policy engagement into the mix isn't always there are challenges to that if people feel that it's not recognised. So I was wondering if that had been part of your work, and also if anybody else in the room today has any comments on that from their own sort of institutional experiences, because I think it's probably varying across the country the extent to which it's being properly recognised as the work of the languages academic.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great point. And it's something, it's not a part of the project, but it's something that Wendy, Charles and I have spoken about in terms of trying to persuade academics to submit summaries. As you say, on a very busy plate. How can I persuade academics to give up their time to do that? And so it's hard to know whether it's the cart pulling the horse or the other way around, in terms of, do we need academics to do that work to then prove to the universities that it's a value, and we then hope that universities then understand what the value is? Or do we hope that universities encourage academics to do it and it functions that way? I don't have any good answer for that. As you well know, it's such a complicated issue, and I'm so happy to see that the funding bodies are leading the charge in terms of having those opportunities. And I think, in the same way that we saw with public engagement, a decade ago, when the culture around that changed and we understood that it's now a really important pillar of research that has to be included, I think we're definitely seeing that change from the funding body perspective with policy. But I agree, I think there is a long way to go in terms of universities. And I'm not sure what the answer to that question is. I hope that the academics that we have in more senior positions that sit in those meetings, making some of those higher level decisions, hopefully, if we can be engaging academics at a wider level to be engaged in policy, maybe some of that work trickles into that decision making and funding and time research allocation. But it's a really great point to raise. I couldn't agree more. It is definitely a complication in doing this work. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it is a huge issue concerning, because policy work does take time. You do have to make connections. It is valuable. It's not only valuable, it's essential for the well-being of our disciplinary community. And yet often it is taken to be something that someone does down the corridor and that doesn't necessarily affect me. And the incentive structure that you obtained in universities doesn't necessarily reflect or recognize the work that is done in this area. I wonder if Claire, you've made a comment. Claire Guerrero has made a comment in the chat. If you can comment on this.
Yeah, thanks, George. I put two things in the chat there. The first thing, I know it depends on the institution, that impact accelerator accounts are a massive, not only funder of policy-related work, but also provide incentives and trainings. I know that there are only 35, I think, or so HRC impact accelerator accounts, but I want to encourage, of course, to look at ESRC as well, if they're in that crossover arena, because that funding at institutional level can provide an extraordinarily rich community of practice. And many IAs will have training and public engagement programs involved. So I know it's very, very uneven across the UK, but those are what the AHRC and particularly ESC are thinking about as the seed ground for training academics and funding them to try and do policy focused work with a model of fast failure. So as you're saying, Olivia, it doesn't always work the way that you intended. It can be serendipitous, it can be a cul-de-sac, it can be an extraordinarily open arena. I think also when you work in this area, I think being prepared for failure, we know with a small f, I try something again, it doesn't work. And thinking again is an important part of the mindset rather than seeing it as a linear process. I think your roadmap's great, but I think it's probably more of a tree than a road. And it probably is much more multifaceted when you're involved. And then secondly, of course, REF's a massive incentive. Impact case studies are what you're talking about, Olivia. So to some degree, if you are already on the radar of your public engagement and REF team, that will probably provide additional support and incentives to develop it, although that's obviously going to be a small sliver of the work undertaken. UNI is now very highly aware of the both strategic but economic value of an impact case study. So I know that's a bit more instrumentalist, but we shouldn't be unaware that there are incentives structurally within the funding framework which make these projects particularly valuable. Anybody starting out on the call here today, I mean, it may be part of your long-term career in 20 years' time that you might begin an impact-related activity set that would be a core part of who you are in 5 or 10 years' time, because it'd be a part of the expected pluridimensional role that academics have. That will be my assessment going forward, that it will become an increasing part of the toolkit of an academic.
Thank you, Claire. That's very valuable. I mean, I think there are ways in which one can be quite intervention about this. Certainly, you have to recognise incentive structures. REF is very important as far as this is concerned. What we can do is talk to the heads of modern languages, a special interest group of the UCFL, and really, press the point that this work needs to become part, as Claire Guerrero was saying, part of an academics toolkit moving forward. It isn't something that should be focused simply on those who wish to do this kind of work or think it's important. It should be part of everyone's panoply of operations to different degrees. But we can really take this question to people from to the heads of association. Natalie's on the call. Perhaps Natalie, I can bring you in here, and also Charles Forsdick, a former chair of the REF panel. So Natalie.
Hi,
Natalie?
Charles. Sorry, I'm having a problem with the phone. Hang on a sec. Well, I think you can probably hear me. Thanks very much.
We can hear you perfectly well, Natalie, so don't worry about the visuals.
Oh, okay, Gran. Thanks very much. Liv, I thought that was fantastic. Thanks very much. And you and I are already in touch about you coming to Bristol, in fact, aren't you, to give this talk. So we'll carry on that conversation. Yeah, look, I'm happy to put that on the agenda for us, Charles, for our next, I think we've got a meeting coming up. I think it's the last week of May or the first week of June. And I think that this would be helpful for us to have a chat about. I mean, certainly from my perspective in Bristol, I'm trying to link policy engagement to impact work in promotion statements, for example. So I'm trying to get it on the agenda that way and trying to get people rewarded and recognised for that work by linking it through impact, which is very well recognised by promotion committees and the like here. But of course, I've still got colleagues coming to me and saying, well, I didn't get promotion. I have all these publications, but I've been really focusing on policy impact, and that wasn't taken into account the same way as my colleagues' 2 monographs were. So it's going to be a discussion going forward. But Charles, why don't we take this offline and have a chat about when we can get, maybe if Olivia, you want to come to the next meeting of the SIG, and we can talk about it then.
Thank you, Natalie. That's extremely helpful. I mean, this joined up thinking and really leading to infrastructural change and involvement of people, and seeing this as empowering and not as a burden is absolutely essential. So absolutely, we'll talk about that.
Great, thanks.
Liv, thanks, Natalie. Liv, do you want to come back on any of the points that Natalie has raised?
I actually, if we can, I just wanted to jump back to the point that Claire made about sort of failure with a _F, if I can, and thank you, Claire, for all of your points, but that one in particular I think is really important. It's so true, and one of the reasons why I think a recommendation for policy work, where I was talking about not to get too daunted by the big dramatic moments and to start small, is really important, because you may well have no one reply to your email. If you speak to an NGO, we all know that working on shoestring budgets. When Wendy, Charles, and I started this project, Wendy said to me, when we email all of these government departments to consult and get their thoughts, we might get no replies from anyone. We of course had great engagement from them, which is a credit to the work that Wendy's been doing over the years. But I think also having that realistic attitude is really useful, to not be discouraged if, when you start trying to engage with policy, it doesn't go perfectly on the first try. So just to agree with Claire's point there on the failure with a little f.
Thank you. Can I bring Charles Forsdick in with just a couple of reflections on REF and importance going forward?
Thank you, Charles, very much so. Look, I really welcome this session. I welcome this whole series of sessions that you're organising. But this one in particular for 2 reasons. Firstly, I think it gives us a chance to see the fantastic work that Liv has been doing. This is a project that has not been running for a particularly long time, and Liv has really built up capacity, created a whole range of contacts, but also crucially, and if you come to the workshop that she mentioned, has developed some absolutely fantastic materials which allow us to do this fundamental work of translating the findings of language-related research into policy. So really welcome this. The other reason I think this is very positive is it shows how really over the past decade or so, we've achieved a greater degree of maturity in thinking about languages and policy. If I go back to the build-up to REF 2014, when impact and impact case studies were first introduced, there was a lot of skepticism, even hostility from our community and from the humanities more broadly, some of it well grounded, some of it less so, about the idea of impact. And we couldn't quite imagine then what, outside certain areas of linguistics, what language's impact would look like. Now, Liv, I think, mentioned history and history and policy is a unit that has been established for a long time. Wendy S. Bennett, our collaborator on this project, has been working on languages and policy for a while, and through her MITES project, the Owry project was involved in or indeed set up the Languages Society Policy Journal. What we're seeing, though, and I think this is what the work Liv's talking about, is this sort of broadening out of the base here and saying that this is not just about specific areas of policy on language education and skills. It's not just about certain areas of linguistics. This is something that if we put our mind to it and we think together and we get institutional support and we have the right tools, many more of us in languages, particularly those of us who work on literature and culture, in which we can be involved. So I think we've seen this really positive evolution from the launch of Impact, and this is picking up your challenge, Charles, talk a bit about REF, from the launch of Impact as part of REF 2014, which was very fledgling and quite patchy, to a stabilization of what we can do through Impact in REF 2021. Now we're clearly, departments are preparing and thinking about REF 2029. And I think what Liv's outlined is really, really helpful for departments to think about how policy might form part of their impact offer. I say this every time I talk about impact. It's not all about policy. There are numerous ways in which we, across the languages disciplines, can demonstrate the impact of what we do. But two final points. One is, at a time of real turbulence and precarity for our departments and our fields, this is absolutely essential work. Liv said this at the very beginning. This is a way of asserting the centrality of what we do in languages to domestic society and policy, but also to broader global concerns. So we really need to embrace this agenda and have an equal seat at the table. The other thing is, and a number of colleagues have mentioned this, it takes time and effort. And we need to make sure we're putting pressure on heads of department, people like me, to ensure that this is reflected in workload modeling and is properly acknowledged, particularly in promotions too. The final point I'd make, and this is a source of real frustration, is that impact case studies themselves, the template, it's only fit for the purpose it's designed for, and that is to allow REF subpanels to judge the reach and significance of impact. In terms of those of us who want to use that incredible database of impact case studies after the exercise for communication to influence policy, impact case studies, there's no standardization of language, the fields aren't quite right for our purposes. There's a real issue there. That's why what Liv's doing, go to the workshop and you'll see it, what Liv's doing is saying, look, we can translate our research into much more user-friendly, policy user-friendly formats. But I think what we need to do, and this is rather beyond the remit of this meeting, as we feed into the consultation on what REF 2029 is going to look like, let's try and push Research England and the other research funding councils to think a bit more about what that impact case study looks like, so we can use it much more effectively outside REF for the sorts of purposes we're talking about.
Thank you very much, Charles. All those points are extremely important, and they are built into the way in which we need to think about the present and the future. Liv, do you want to come back on some of the things that Charles has said?
I think I totally agree with the point that Charles has made, that Charlotte mentioned, about how do we try to put pressure on heads of department and departments in general to give us the time and the space and the resources to do this work, because as Charles mentioned, it takes a lot of time to build these relationships. We're all working to different timelines and time capacities with civil servants. You know, they're working on really short time deadlines. It's really difficult to get hold of them. So it's not something that happens overnight. And so I would love to see better institutional support to do that. And also in terms of this project that I'm on, it's one of the very few instances that I've seen opportunities for ECAs to get involved in policy. So I would also love to see, I know, Charlotte's done work on this in Oxford in the languages space for ECAs and DPhils. Would love to see more training and more opportunities for ECAs to get involved so that we can also start that new generation of academics coming through who have this toolkit already embedded into their skill set. Maybe that's work that I need to do in terms of running trainings for ECAs. We do actually have some policy events. I'm involved in the UCFL ECA SIG group, and we do have some policy events coming up that I'm running that I'm excited about. So yeah, just agreement with Charles on that need and that call for institutional support, really, I would say.
Thank you, Liv. I wonder if Joe Lee has made a comment in the chat. If you could come in. I mean, it is extremely important for us to work as a community to share resources, expertise, thinking about how we can do some of these things together without reinventing the wheel, bringing people to this table, and how we can commit with our institutional hats on, but also as we work as a community. Anyone who's worked with Wendy Ayres Bennett is amazed by the endless generosity with which she devotes to the subject community in making sure that this is a dimension of our work. So Joe, can you ask you to reflect a bit on how you bring people into this area?
Yeah, I mean, my thoughts. Well, thank you, Olivia. It was a fantastic presentation. Yes, I could have listened for longer, which is not often the case. So thank you for that. I think one of the things we really struggle with in modern languages and cultures and societies is the visibility of what we do and communicating to the wider public that what we do is not just teach languages. That's very important. Multilingualism is important, but what we do is much wider than that. And it always depresses me, even when I'm talking to other academics within my own institution, they are surprised that we do research in modern languages. So this isn't just about, it's important that we feed into policy, but this isn't separating out research from undergraduate teaching. Communicating to applicants on open days the value of the degrees that we offer and doing more and more languages isn't just part of that. The importance of the cultural element of what we teach, and that isn't isolated, to just reading literature. It has a real world impact, and that is so difficult sometimes to communicate. But engaging with policy is a concrete way that we can show our own members of our own institution, parents, applicants, the value of what we're doing in modern languages. It would be great to share the slides that you've given with our wider department. We will promote those workshops if those are open to everybody, I understand, or just members of this group, or everybody?
Nope, open to everyone, all different stages, as many languages as possible as we can have involved. So that I'd be so grateful for that sharing. Thank you.
Yeah, I think to be able to disseminate what you've provided to our department, to get as many of them as possible engaging with the workshops, with the database, but thinking through what they're doing, just taking, as you said, I think at some point taking that step back and thinking of your research in a different context and how it might translate to different audiences is really important.
Thanks so much. Sorry, Charles.
No, please, Liv, go ahead.
No, thank you, Joe. I really appreciate that determination and support of the workshops. I've dropped the slides in the chat for who hasn't seen. And I think I totally agree with this point where academics, some, not all, are just really unclear about how their research fits into any of this. Academics that we know who don't see where languages intersects with everything, I would argue. And even though the database is primarily, the audience primarily is policymakers, I really think it has huge value as a knowledge broker for us as academics as well. Myself, again, as I've mentioned, being in Portuguese literature and film, I'm the classic academic that thought, I don't know how that fits into policy. I really don't. And even from doing this project and looking at amazing projects like Claire's, like Heike's, and pulling together these sample summaries where I've had the luxury of collating, 15 best practice examples. It's been amazing for me to be inspired by the work that other colleagues are doing in that space, and it's been instrumental in designing the reading bodies work that I then was mentioning to Manon in the first question. One has entirely influenced the other, so I'm really looking forward to when the database goes live and other academics can also benefit from having that bank of inspiration. So I really hope that also will help convince other academics in the field that maybe are a little more insecure about where their work might fit in this space.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And just in terms of change of mindset, really, I think public engagement is now part of how we're thinking about research, but taking that step and thinking of policy engagement as that next progression is really helpful.
Absolutely, Jo and Liv. It is fundamental to our standing, how we talk to parents, how we talk to future students, how we talk to our colleagues in universities, obviously how we speak to the wider world, even if you're giving a first-year lecture. If you can show the impact that your standing is automatically increased. Wendy, can I bring you in here?
Thank you, Charles, and thank you, Liv, for a really super presentation. Yes, I think the point about it taking time is a really important one, and to have a fairly long-term horizon for it. And I think that's why it's good if you're at your early career researcher to start now thinking about it, because it may be not the next ref, but the ref after, where you really can have the impact that you want. And I wanted to say that we're trying to work with policymakers to get things like the areas of research interest to incorporate a little bit more about languages, but not to be put off by the language in them. They are interested in, for example, I was very struck by Manon's question. We've been doing some stuff with the Home Office, and as part of a presentation on modern slavery, we presented some work on the history of slavery and modern slavery elsewhere. So they're interested in the lessons from history, and they're interested in the lessons from other cultures, societies, and what they can bring to the UK. So I think there is a greater interest amongst policymakers than you might imagine, as long as you can translate that, what you can learn from history, into some real world examples. So I think there is a huge scope for us all to engage, and there's a real interest amongst policymakers not just to have the hardcore quantitative data, which many of us don't necessarily work with, to hearing much more about the kind of work that Heike's been doing, or people who, like Alison Phipps, have been doing on the lived experience. What does it mean to be someone suffering with anorexia? What does it mean to be a Ukrainian refugee arriving in the UK and being given a Russian-speaking interpreter? And these are things that we can all think about, and bring examples from our literary and cultural studies into stories of the lived experience, and how we can learn from them, either from the past or from other cultures. Thank you, Charles.
Thank you, Wendy. That's a very powerful point on which to end. Liv, do you want to conclude by saying anything?
Just a thank you to everyone for their time, for their engagement, for their questions. I really hope that this presentation has hopefully removed a few myths around policy engagement being daunting. Not to say that it's easy, but hopefully this has given a few actionable steps and people feel emboldened to get involved. And please get in touch with me if you'd like to be at that workshop. I would love to see you there. And any questions, comments, thoughts, feedback in general, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me.
Thank you so much, Liv. Thank you to everyone for coming, and a massive thank you for a terrific session, which we will do everything possible to take forward. So thank you, Liv, and thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much, Charles.